The truth behind the false allegations by the National Green Tribunal Expert Committee against Art of Living. The World Culture Festival was held on the banks of the River Yamuna on the 11th, 12th, 13th of March 2016. The expert committee set up by the National Green Tribunal, or NGT, has submitted 2 reports that contain their claims of alleged damage to the Yamuna floodplain due to the event. These reports are the preliminary report and the final report. Both reports contain highly questionable reasoning and are full of unscientific claims. If we go through all of them, this video would be longer than that movie Lagan. So, to keep this video short and sweet, here are some of their greatest hits. Number 1. Alleging that the Art of Living needed permission from the NGT before holding the World Culture Festival on the Yamuna floodplains. This is the area on the floodplain where the event was held. The expert committee alleges we needed prior permission from the NGT to hold the event on the floodplain. The entire site belongs to the Delhi Development Authority, or the DDA, who gave us permission to go ahead with the event. Nowhere in the permission letter given by the DDA does it say that prior permission from the NGT is required. You may pause the video here and read through it yourself. Moreover, the NGT is a court, a tribunal, not a government agency like the DDA or the MEFCC that give out permissions. In addition to taking permission from the DDA, we took permission from the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, the Delhi Pollution Control Committee, the Uttar Pradesh Irrigation Committee, the Delhi Disaster Management Authority, the Irrigation and Flood Control Department of Delhi, just to name a few. Number 2. Alleging presence of wetlands on the event site. Throughout both reports, the expert committee alleged the presence of wetlands on the event site. You may wonder, what's the big deal? Wetland, floodplain, wetplain, whatever, same difference. Not quite. By the Ramsar Convention of 1971, wetlands are protected areas, and any kind of gathering on a wetland is strictly prohibited. Being ecologically protected zones, they fall under purview of the NGT. But floodplains where public and religious functions can be held do not need environmental clearance. Luckily for us, the site where the World Culture Festival was held is not a wetland, nor does it contain any wetlands. How can we be so sure? Well, in addition to the fact that both reports produce no evidence to prove otherwise, here are a bunch of reasons why. The Survey of India is India's central engineering agency in charge of mapping and surveying. The Delhi Guide Map 3rd edition 1989, published by the Survey of India, describes the event site as extremely flat, without undulation, and devoid of any wetland and or enclosed water body. Next, in March 2011, the Space Applications Center ISRO published an elaborate document titled National Wetland Atlas. Flip over to the section in Chapter 8, which elaborately covers and lists 399 wetlands in Delhi, but has not identified even a single wetland on the event site. Even the small water bodies just outside the event site have been described as man-made. Satellite images available on Google Earth clearly show that the event site never had any wetlands at all, but rather this area was under agricultural use since at least 22nd December 2000, which is as far back as you can go in Google Earth. Lastly, the event site allotted to the Art of Living belonged to the village Kilokri. There were crops, harvested farmlands on the entire site. To get the farmland free from various farming activity, the Art of Living had to pay to various farmers compensations against the standing crops, early harvesting, and not farming during the month leading up to the event. However, a few farmers refused to take the compensation and continued farming on the basis of this petition issued by the Delhi High Court. No activity was done on those farms, and the petition further establishes that the event site is agricultural land, even in the eyes of the Delhi High Court. So, it's pretty clear the World Culture Festival site is not a wetland, not a wet plain, but rather a floodplain that's been turned into a farmland. Number 3. Alleging complete destruction of all vegetation on the floodplain. Throughout their reports, the expert committee make various absurd claims like the event site is completely devoid of any vegetation and that no plant cover was visible anywhere. Now, we just established this area was a farmland. So the only vegetation that was present here, apart from some trees, were bangan, bhindi, and cauliflower. And you know what actually is devoid of vegetation? This is. It's called a desert. And even it's not devoid of vegetation. If you think devoid is a strong word, they go on to claim that all the vegetation on the site is completely destroyed, not simply damaged. They try to make it sound like we did this, and the site looks like this, when in reality, the site looks like this. That too, a few weeks after the event. And just to make sure not a single tree was cut, the number of trees before the event and right after the event were counted using high-res satellite images, and the numbers were exactly the same. On top of that, they claim that the floodplain lost all its natural vegetation because of an event which took place on 25 hectare out of the 9,300 hectare total area of the floodplain. Just to put that into perspective, this is the area of the event site, and this is the total area of the floodplain. The report even mentions that water hyacinth was removed and destroyed. Water hyacinth is found here in water. The event was held here on land. So why would we remove it? Furthermore, one of the expert committee members, Professor Brijgopal, wrote this book. If you flip over to page 43 in the chapter titled Introduction of Invasive Alien Species, Professor Gopal goes ahead and classifies water hyacinth as a weed and says it's an invasive species that are an important threat to wetlands. Even the Indian government pays crores a year to remove them from our rivers. So it seems pretty head-scratching that Professor Brijgopal and the expert committee would be concerned by the removal of water hyacinth. Moreover, in 2013, a report titled Restoration and Conservation of the River Yamuna was written by 3 members of the expert committee, namely Professor Brijgopal, Professor C.R. Babu, and Professor A.K. Gosain. In this report, they state that the life-supporting potential of the river is lost. The river and floodplain ecosystems are lost. The stretch of the Yamuna where the event site is located has 0 dissolved oxygen content, in which no life can survive, and that the floodplain biodiversity is lost. But in the restoration plans outlined by these same committee members in their final report, they state the need to restore fish, birds, plant life that was killed and destroyed by the event. How can we kill and destroy something that, according to the same committee members, were dead and hence never there to begin with? The expert committee go on to make even more absurd and self-defeating claims like, quote, total loss cannot be readily visualized and documented, and this is an invisible loss of biodiversity that cannot be easily assessed. It seems very suspiciously convenient that all the biodiversity that's been lost or damaged is either invisible or can't be visualized nor documented. How do you see the loss if it's invisible? It's like someone claiming their house burned down, but there's no evidence to suggest it ever existed in the first place. Number 4. Alleging compaction and leveling of the floodplain. Throughout both reports, the expert committee alleged that the floodplains have been compacted and leveled due to the event. The expert committee have calculated an approximate cost of 29 crore to undo the imaginary compaction of soil by the 3-day World Culture Festival. Why imaginary? Well, because the floodplain soil where the event was held is sandy, and sandy soil cannot be compacted. And here's why. It's a well-established fact that the soil type of North Indian floodplains is characterized as 95% sand. One of the expert committee members, Professor A.K. Gosain, authored this, a case study on the Yamuna where he characterizes the floodplain soil as sandy. Moreover, remember this, the study on the Yamuna by the 3 expert committee members? Go on over to page 20 of the report where the soil type of the Yamuna is described as sand with gravel. So pretty much the expert committee members themselves claim that the soil in the floodplain is classified as sandy. Now why can't sand be compacted, you ask? Stay with us, this is going to get a little sciencey. According to the textbooks of soil mechanics by Professor V.N.S. Murthy, the pressure-void ratio curves for sand show that over 90% of compaction of loose sand takes place in less than 2 minutes after it's been deposited, which implies that the compaction of sand at the event site took place decades before the event due to farming, construction of roads, flyovers, etc., forming what we call dense sand, which is now present at the event site. Looking at the same curves for dense sand, we find that even enormous amounts of pressure causes negligible amount of compaction. Moreover, to compact a 25-hectare area of land, you'll need not just one, but an army of vibrating rollers. Now, an average human being weighs around 62 kilos. A single large roller weighs around 25,000 kilos and is around 2 meters wide. For human beings to exert the same weight as a roller on a comparable area of the ground, you'll have to line up 4 people shoulder to shoulder and then proceed to stack 396 people of the same weight on their heads. Now, we know for a fact that not a single roller was operating on the event site, and we are certain that teams of 4 people weren't running around the event site carrying 396 people on their heads. So it's highly unlikely that a 3-day cultural event led to compaction of the floodplain. Coming to the World Culture Festival stage, it was the world's first and only floating stage. Most large structures of comparable size would require a solid foundation of concrete pillars that originate at a considerable depth below ground. Building such a stage would have heavily damaged the Yamuna floodplain. Instead of distributing the load across a few large concrete pillars, our stage was built with thin scaffolding rods reinforced in a lattice-like structure. The foundation of the stage consisted of thousands of such scaffolding rods spread across the 7.5-acre area of the stage. Each one of these rods in the foundation rested on a 1 foot by 1 foot raft footing, further reducing the weight per unit area. The principles of physics that allow a yogi to lay on a bed of nails without getting impaled, or a balloon that bursts with the prick of a single needle but remains intact despite being pushed down against several such needles, are the same principles that allowed our stage to leave the ground undamaged despite being so large and holding so much weight. Finally, the only court-permissible test to determine compaction is the California Bearing Ratio Test, or CBR test. It involves taking soil samples before and after a specified date and then applying the test. Since the expert committee did not collect any soil samples in order to arrive at a factual conclusion, we requested permission from the NGT to voluntarily conduct the CBR test at the event site. The application was disposed of without granting permission. If this permission had been granted, the facts would have emerged conclusively, further resolving the issue. Number 5. Bias in the expert committee reports. In their reports, the expert committee have relied upon a singular satellite image before the event as opposed to a larger sample size covering pre-monsoon and post-monsoon images for 15 to 20 years despite its availability to the public via Google Earth. The satellite image dated 5th September 2015 was taken during peak monsoon season in Delhi. By comparing it to a midsummer picture from March 2016, after the event, the expert committee tried to attribute the negative effect of lack of rain to the event. This is what we call clear selection bias of the sample satellite imagery. Now, we're going to demonstrate how we can make selection bias work to our advantage. Compare the image on top, a pre-monsoon image from January 2008, with the image on the bottom, a post-monsoon, post-event image from September 2016. Paints a totally different picture, doesn't it? Comparing these two pictures, we could claim that the World Culture Festival helped magically rejuvenate the entire floodplain. Scientifically speaking, selection bias is defined as the selection of individuals, groups, or data for analysis in such a way that proper randomization is not achieved, thereby ensuring that the sample obtained is not a representation of the situation which was intended to be analyzed. That definition might have left you a little confused. Think of it this way. Imagine there is someone who strongly believes that the sun doesn't exist and concludes it's a true statement because the one time he looked up at the sky to check if the sun was there or not, it happened to be night. That is what we call selection bias, specifically selecting data to support one's claim and ignoring data that doesn't. Legally, just the selection bias of the satellite images invalidates the expert committee report in its entirety. The committee is not just biased in their selection of data, but also in their outlook of the entire case. Throughout the preliminary and final reports, the expert committee submit that they are unable to assess the cost of the alleged damage. But they were somehow magically able to come up with a compensation amount of 120 crore for the damage, that too with a self-admitted singular visit to the event site where a visual assessment was made. That's like going to a doctor who, after glancing in your general direction, hands you a list of ailments he assesses you suffer from and proceeds to slap you with a fat bill for your future treatment. How comfortable will you be with that assessment? Even the head of the expert committee, Mr. Shankar, wrote in a letter to the NGT that the penalty of 120 crore was an inadvertent mistake which he did not endorse and that it was not based on any scientific assessment. Furthermore, there was no scientific study or quantifiable data that was provided as evidence for the list of alleged damage. The expert committee, in its final report, went on to state that they are unable to differentiate between the activities required to restore the floodplain and the activities to undo the alleged damage due to the event. That's a very clever way of saying that they can't differentiate between the damage done to the floodplain before the event and the damage done by the event. They go on to support our implication later in the final report when they state that the damage done was due to past construction, farming, dumping of debris, and to some extent due to the event. What does some extent mean? A third, a fourth, half? Even some of the expert committee members were contesting the unscientific nature of the reports. This is evident in this email conversation between expert committee member Dr. Nitin K. Labeshwar and the other members. He states that, quote, some of these claims of damage and cost are still debatable and he may not fully agree. He goes on to say, quote, I feel it'll be better to discuss and reach a consensus on evidences and scientific logic. Number 6, going from ecological restoration to ecological rehabilitation of the floodplain. Throughout the first report, the expert committee members wrote about restoration of the alleged damage, and by the final report, they switched to using the word rehabilitation. Now you may ask, what's the big deal? Restoration, rehabilitation, they sound like the same thing. Not quite. So first, let's understand the difference between restoration and rehabilitation in this context. Picture this. You need to go buy some groceries. You don't have any transportation, so you ask your neighbor if you can use his car. Now mind you, his car doesn't look like this. It looks more like this. Your neighbor agrees to lend you his car on the condition you restore it to the state you found it in. You say, no problem. You do your grocery shopping, you fill some fuel in the car, and you return it in the exact same condition you found it in. Now out of the blue, your neighbor flips the script on you. He no longer wants the car restored to when you took it. Instead, he wants the car rehabilitated. He wants you to fix it up and make it look like new. Now, why would the expert committee switch from restoration to rehabilitation? Simple. They can't prove any damage was done by the event and are hence unable to list to the court the restoration activities and their corresponding cost. But the show must go on and rehabilitation seemed like the only way out. In the final report, they go on to state that there are certain constraints to restoration of the event site, as it is not possible to assess the ecological status of the ecosystems at the site before the event, and also to determine the state of the ecosystem to which restoration has to be carried out. That's a clever way of saying they can't prove any damage took place, so the question of restoration is out the window. They go on to state again that they cannot assess the cost of damage because estimating the cost requires the preparation of a detailed project report that may take several months and financial resources to prepare. Of course, they don't want to make a detailed project report because with the lack of any scientific evidence to prove damage, all the report is going to do is to reveal the fact that no damage was done at all. To top it off, they state that in order to rehabilitate the floodplain, they want to build a biodiversity park, 2 large water bodies, 3-tier planting of vegetation, and establishing sewage treatment plants, among other things. A very noble endeavor, but let's put that in context. Essentially, the expert committee is saying that they cannot prove any damage, and as a consequence cannot assign a cost to restore the damage, because of which they switch from restoration to rehabilitation And in order to rehabilitate the site, they'd like to build this utopian biodiversity park and would like the Art of Living to pay for it. All because we held a 3-day cultural event that did no damage to the floodplain and after taking all the necessary permissions. But ladies and gentlemen, that's not all. The biggest kicker in this entire saga is the following. In order to build this dream park, the expert committee members submitted a budget with the final report that lists salaries for various experts to monitor and supervise construction. These salaries total up to 7 crore. They go on to state that the supervision and monitoring of this project will take close to 10 years and then proceed to volunteer themselves for the 7 crore job. Let that sink in for a second. After failing gloriously to prove and assign costs for the alleged damage, the expert committee, whose only job is to give an unbiased assessment, comes up with this grand utopian plan that has nothing to do with restoration, the cost of which includes salaries for experts to the tune of 7 crore, which the expert committee members asked to be paid to them. This goes beyond bias and can be called nothing else but corruption.